justice or protecting corruption. Thomas leans on reputation and legal jargon, but within minutes, Crockett drops evidence so devastating he's left speechless. If the most powerful judge in America can't defend the truth, is the whole system built on a lie? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside a soundproof chamber carved out of Capitol Hill's granite bones, something unprecedented was about to unfold. The room, usually home to bipartisan decorum and scripted outrage, was stripped of its usual audience. No press, no aides, no blinking red lights. Just two microphones, one silent countdown clock set at 90 minutes, and two figures seated across a long, polished oak table. Justice Clarence Thomas and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The subject was clear, sharp, and dangerous. The Supreme Court's long pattern of rulings that favored the powerful and silenced the vulnerable. And today, Crockett wasn't here to debate. She was here to confront Thomas face to face, with the data, the cases, and the consequences. Thomas arrived early, crisp in a white shirt and silver cufflinks bearing the Supreme Court seal. He sat like a man who'd beaten history, who'd survived scandal and scrutiny so many times he no longer feared either. To him, this was just another ritual, another attempt to question a power that had never truly been in danger. He was calm, certain, untouchable. Then Jasmine Crockett entered. Alone. No notes. No advisors. Just an iPad and the quiet composure of someone who wasn't here to ask for permission. Her eyes locked on Thomas, steady, unblinking. She didn't raise her voice or perform for headlines, but something in her silence made the air tense, electric. She wasn't there to argue. She was there to expose. The clock began ticking. 90 minutes, one table, one woman who had everything to prove, and one man who'd spent a lifetime never having to answer. The balance of power didn't shift all at once, but in that first moment, it trembled. The silence didn't last long, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't built for theatrics. She was built for impact, and when she finally spoke, it was like striking a match in a room full of gas. She didn't begin like most do in the presence of a Supreme Court justice. There was no nod of deference, no rehearsed gratitude, no hollow performance of respect for tradition's sake. She opened with a single line, flat and final, as if she were closing a door behind her. I'm not here to ask questions. I'm here to confirm what the public has suspected for far too long. No flourish, no buildup. Just the sound of a woman who had already done the math, followed the trail, and returned not for a dialogue, but for an answer. Thomas didn't flinch, but the smallest twitch in his left brow betrayed what decades on the bench had taught him to hide. Surprise. He had expected a skirmish, yes, but one he could absorb with doctrine and outwait with silence. What he wasn't prepared for was a confrontation that didn't open with permission, but with purpose. Jasmine tapped once on her iPad. The room remained quiet, the only sound a faint hum from the ceiling vents and the mechanical blink of the screen lighting up behind her. Citizens United Veer FC. The name itself had become synonymous with the floodgates of money unleashed on American democracy. But it wasn't the case title that made Thomas's jaw tighten. It was the number underneath. $3.4 billion in dark money since ruling. She didn't speak in outrage. She didn't have to. The numbers carried their own indictment. Quietly, she traced the decision's lineage, how corporate entities gained personhood in political speech, how the barrier between private wealth and public policy had been dissolved in a single opinion. Your pen, she said softly, didn't just rewrite the law. It rewrote who gets to participate in democracy. Still, Thomas said nothing, but his grip on the edge of the table changed, no longer resting, now bracing. Then came Shelby County versus Holder. Jasmine didn't dramatize it. She just read off the results like a surgeon listing internal injuries. More than 1,600 polling places were shut down, most of them in communities of color. Within just 18 months, 23 states rushed to pass strict voter ID laws, many of which disproportionately impacted low-income and minority voters. And in majority black districts across the South, voter turnout fell by as much as 12%. These aren't numbers, she said, her voice tightening. These are Americans. and they disappeared from the ballot box after your ruling tore out the heart of the Voting Rights Act. Thomas finally moved. He cleared his throat, sat upright, and leaned forward just enough to signal that he was ready to respond, not to concede but to counter. He spoke in the deep, even tone that had once disarmed Senate committees and silenced legal scholars. He invoked originalism, citing the founders. He reminded her that the Constitution was a fixed document, one whose meaning could not bend with the moods of modern politics. The Constitution is fixed, he said, and the court must interpret it as it was written. It was a polished response. It always was. But Crockett didn't blink. She didn't even pause. Instead, she leaned in with the calm of someone who had heard these words too many times in too many courtrooms, offered as justification for outcomes that only ever seemed to benefit the same class of people. The Constitution isn't a relic. It's not a totem to be worshipped from a distance. It's a contract between the people and their government. And you, Justice Thomas, have turned that contract into a one-sided deal, a system where the wealthy always win and everyone else gets ruled. Her words didn't rise in volume. They didn't need to. The force wasn't in the delivery. It was in the truth behind it. For years, millions of Americans had been told that their voices mattered less because of the paperwork, because of the zip code, because of the ID they didn't carry, or the felony they couldn't expunge. And always, somewhere at the end of that chain of denial, was a ruling signed by the very man now sitting across from her. This moment wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was sharp, deliberate, and irreversible. A fault line had been struck between what the court claimed it did and what its rulings had actually wrought. Clarence Thomas didn't speak again, not yet, and Jasmine Crockett didn't press further, not yet. But the shift had begun, one ruling at a time, one case at a time. She was building the argument that would expose something bigger than contradiction. She was after something no justice, no robe, no precedent could deflect: accountability. But Jasmine hadn't come this far to argue about principles in the abstract. She came to put numbers on the table and force him to face what they meant in the real world. She tapped her iPad again. The screen behind her shifted. Gone were the case names and legal jargon. Now there were just numbers. Big, brutal numbers. No fluff, no spin. Just facts, bold and red against a black background, impossible to ignore. 92%, 83%, 79%. The silence in the room grew heavier as the figures glowed like silent accusations. Jasmine stood still, letting the weight of it all settle before she spoke. Her tone didn't rise. She didn't need theatrics. Her weapon was precision. Over the past 30 years, she said slowly, clearly, 92% of your rulings favored corporations over workers or regulators. She turned slightly, watching Thomas, but not pressing yet. 83% went against labor protections, overtime, collective bargaining, safety on the job, and 79% of those decisions had a direct, measurable impact on communities of color. Voting rights rolled back, sentencing standards that hit black defendants harder, environmental protections gutted in neighborhoods where kids are already breathing in poison. She paused, not for effect, but for truth. She needed it to land. That's not interpretation, she said. That's a pattern. And it's written in lives, not law. Still, Thomas said nothing. His hands, once folded comfortably in front of him, now rested tighter on the edge of the table. His jaw clenched just slightly. The look in his eyes didn't change, but the silence did. It wasn't calm anymore. It was defensive. It was bracing. Jasmine saw it, but she didn't push, not recklessly. Instead, she leaned in with the same quiet force that had carried her through courtrooms long before she ever entered Congress. When the Second Amendment is on the line, she continued, her voice level and direct, you apply strict scrutiny. Every word in the Constitution treated like gospel. Every phrase dissected. You demand proof. You require precision. It's all sacred. She waited. One beat. Two. But when it's the right to vote, she went on, suddenly the standard softens. Suddenly context matters. Suddenly we defer to the states, even when those states pass laws that close polling places in black neighborhoods and purge voters by the tens of thousands. She didn't yell. She didn't even frown. But her voice had become something new, sharper, icy, focused. And then came the question. Why is it, she asked, that some rights show up in your courtroom wrapped in armor, while others crawl in, bloody, just begging to be seen? The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They just hung there, heavy, alive. And that was when Thomas broke his silence. His voice, for the first time that day, cut through the air with something different. Not control, not authority, but irritation. The unmistakable sharpness of a man who felt cornered. "You're politicizing the law," he snapped. The words weren't shouted. They didn't have to be. They were meant to draw a line in the sand, to flip the script, to put her on defense. But Jasmine didn't take the bait. She didn't flinch. Her reply came instantly, measured but undeniable. "I'm humanizing it, and if it can't protect real people, then it's already failed." No applause, no gasps, just stillness. A dense, charged silence that said everything no one else dared speak aloud. Because in that moment, she wasn't just pointing to abstract bias or vague consequences. She was putting a mirror in front of the most powerful judicial voice in the country and asking him to look at what that voice had done. She wasn't calling him evil. She wasn't accusing him of corruption. She was saying something more dangerous, that the law, as he had shaped it, was no longer serving the people it was meant to protect. And that truth, that quiet, piercing truth, it couldn't be answered with citations or founding documents. It didn't go away with doctrine or Latin phrases. It sat there, staring back. Because when she said, if it can't protect real people, then it's already failed, she wasn't talking about theory. She was talking about the mother who lost her Medicaid coverage, the father who couldn't vote because he didn't have a driver's license, the worker who died in an unregulated factory while Wall Street cheered. And Clarence Thomas knew it. This wasn't about constitutional philosophy anymore. It was about impact. She had crossed the line most politicians fear, the one between legal logic and moral consequence. And once crossed, that line can't be uncrossed. Because after that, there's no more hiding behind legal process. There's only the question, who gets protected and who gets sacrificed? Thomas didn't answer that question. Not out loud. Not yet. But the silence was no longer his shield. It was his exposure. And Jasmine? She just waited. Calm. Ready. She knew she had just touched the nerve no one else had the courage to press. And the next 60 minutes would determine whether the law would rise to meet the people or retreat once again into power. And once she called out the system's failure, she didn't stop. Because if Thomas claimed his rulings followed fixed legal principles, Jasmine was about to show just how often those principles bent for the powerful. She stepped closer to the table, her voice calm but gaining force, like thunder rolling in. "You've said again and again that your job is to follow the law exactly as it's written," she began. "You've claimed you don't make policy. You just apply the same rules every time." Then she tapped her screen. Behind her, the display changed. 2 court cases, almost identical in legal question, but with completely different outcomes. In McLean versus Hudson Energy, a major utility company was protected by a generous interpretation of corporate rights. But just a few months later, in Santos versus State Employment Board, an hourly worker was denied back pay because that same principle was suddenly interpreted in a much stricter way. Jasmine's voice didn't waver. Same law, same issue. But when it was a corporation, the court was flexible. When it was a regular worker, the court slammed the door. She kept going, not giving him a moment to breathe. In Reynolds Capital versus SEC, you said government oversight created an undue burden on business innovation, so the rules were thrown out. But in Henderson versus Department of Labor, where a man lost 3 fingers in a poultry plant, you ruled inspections weren't required because workers had other ways to protect themselves. She looked him dead in the eye. 1 man, 3 fingers, no justice, and yet somehow the burden only exists when it's about corporations, not human lives. Thomas stayed silent, but his hands had moved, no longer resting, now tense on the edge of the table. Jasmine pressed harder. In Carrington versus Texas Voting Board, you said small clerical mistakes weren't enough to justify court action. Voters had to suffer in silence. But in Prescott Holdings versus Tax Commission, you ruled that the very same kind of error was enough to cancel a fine against a hedge fund. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Why does grace always go up the ladder, Justice Thomas? Why does mercy get delivered to the wealthy in full, but reaches the rest of us in drops? No one clapped. No one dared. This wasn't theater. Jasmine Crockett wasn't giving a speech. She was delivering evidence. And in that silent, breathless room, she didn't need a judge to rule. The truth was already doing it for her. The pressure in the room was no longer rising. It was already there, thick and electric. And that's when Thomas finally reached for his favorite escape hatch: context. He shifted slightly in his chair, drawing in a measured breath, then spoke in that familiar judicial cadence: slow, deliberate, and deliberately distant. Each case has its own facts, he said. You can't compare outcomes without accounting for different legal contexts. It was the classic move: retreat into technicality, sidestep the pattern. Context was safe. Context made everything sound neutral. It let a judge claim that he wasn't responsible for the impact of his rulings, only for the logic inside them. And to anyone outside that chamber, it might have sounded reasonable, like an honest answer in a complex world. But Jasmine Crockett had spent her life seeing what that reasoning looked like from the other side of the bench. She waited just long enough for the weight of his words to settle, then stepped forward, not with fury, but with precision. Context is real, she acknowledged, but so is consequence. Her tone was firm, steady, not angry, focused. She wasn't dismissing legal nuance. She was demanding that it be held next to reality. Because when context is always used to explain why the wealthy win and the vulnerable lose, it stops being an explanation. It becomes a warning label. Then came the moment that silenced even the air between them. If you're putting principle on the scales, she said, then why does the table always tilt toward power? It wasn't rhetorical. It was rooted in years of lived experience, in courtroom after courtroom, where the law twisted just slightly, just enough, to crush the side with less money, less voice, less power. Jasmine wasn't just pointing out legal inconsistency, she was calling out systemic design. Because the truth was this: if principles were truly applied evenly, they wouldn't always land on the same side of history. But under Thomas's hand, they had, again and again, in campaign finance, in voting rights, in labor disputes, in corporate regulation. The rules changed, but the winner stayed the same. And Jasmine wasn't letting that go unspoken. Her eyes didn't waver. Her voice didn't rise. But the force behind her words made the room feel smaller. Not because she was loud, but because she was right. She had taken the one tool Thomas used to insulate himself, context, and turned it inside out. She showed that context isn't neutral when the results are always predictably unequal. And in that moment, the power dynamic shifted again. Not legally, not officially, but morally and irreversibly. Jasmine tapped her screen again, and behind her, the courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the display shifted to a single, striking image. It wasn't a legal document or a list of rulings. It was a picture. Simple, bold, impossible to ignore. On the screen appeared the familiar symbol of American justice: the scales. But they weren't balanced the way everyone had been taught. Instead, one side of the scale, the side meant to represent ordinary people, the public, the powerless, was hanging high in the air, almost empty. The other side, the side weighted by corporations, influence, and wealth, was sunken low, dragging the beam hard to the right. The message was clear: justice wasn't balanced anymore. And right there in the center of the scale, where the axis of fairness should have been, was a name. Not a symbol, not a court seal, just one name, printed in sharp, unforgiving letters: Clarence Thomas. As the image held, a line of bold red text appeared underneath, glowing softly like an alarm just beginning to sound. It read, "When principle becomes a cover for power." That was it. No speech, no build-up, just the image, the tilt, the name, the truth. It was direct, visual, unforgettable, and it said, without needing to explain further, that something once meant to serve all people equally had slowly, quietly begun to protect the powerful instead. Not by breaking rules, but by twisting the meaning of those rules until they no longer served the people they were written for. Jasmine didn't say anything yet. She just stepped aside slightly, giving the country, watching live, the full view of what she was really arguing. That justice wasn't failing by accident. It was tipping on purpose, and everyone could now see who it was tipping toward. Clarence Thomas didn't speak. For the first time that morning, the man who had spent a lifetime cloaked in composure, armed with precedent and precision, found himself in unfamiliar territory. Absolute stillness. He sat upright, hands folded loosely on the table, the black pen he had been holding now resting idly beside his palm. But his eyes told the truth. They moved, not with confidence, not with the focus of a jurist preparing to dissect an argument, but with something quieter. He looked first to the screen behind Jasmine, then back to her, then to the long stretch of oak before him, polished and perfect, but now stripped of its usual authority. The image burned into the space behind her, the golden scales of justice tilted hard to one side, his name engraved at the center, and beneath it a single searing phrase, "When principle becomes a cover for power." The line wasn't shouted, it wasn't accusatory in tone, it simply existed. But it existed with such undeniable clarity, such precise placement, that it rewrote the atmosphere of the room. It wasn't just calling him out, it was capturing something the nation had long suspected, but had never seen illustrated so plainly. The law, as interpreted by Clarence Thomas, had not merely failed to protect the people, it had grown comfortable doing so. Jasmine wasn't attacking, she was documenting, and it worked. Thomas didn't shift in his chair, but something in his posture sagged, barely visible, but unmistakable. A slight tension in the jaw. The absence of his usual blink, the way his shoulder blades no longer sat as square against the back of his seat. He wasn't unraveling, but he wasn't composed either. His silence filled the room like smoke, heavy, crawling into every corner. Across the country, the silence carried. Television anchors fell quiet. Network producers whispered into headsets, stunned. The camera feed didn't cut away, didn't zoom, didn't blink. It just stayed on him, waiting, the same way the nation was waiting, for a response, for a reaction, for some hint that the man they'd come to see as untouchable still had control over the moment. But he didn't. Not here. Not this time. In every corner of the chamber, stillness reigned. No coughs, no shifting of chairs. Even the rustle of paper, the ever-present soundtrack of a congressional room, had stopped. Behind Thomas, staffers froze. Behind Crockett, no aides moved to pass her anything. The air itself seemed to narrow, closing the distance between power and truth until there was nowhere left to hide. This wasn't a silence of deep thought. This was a silence of impact. It was what happened when a symbol finally met its shadow. And Clarence Thomas, who had built a legacy on firmness, on unwavering judicial stance, was suddenly still not because he chose to be, but because there was no direction left to move without confronting something deeply uncomfortable. The mirror Jasmine Crockett had just placed in front of him. Still, he said nothing. His fingers twitched once, then rested. His lips pressed together, not in resistance, but in retreat. If there was a rebuttal forming in his mind, it never made it past the tension lining his brow. The silence stretched, not by the clock, but by the weight of what was now unspoken. Every second that passed said more than any defense ever could, and Jasmine knew it. She didn't fill the gap. She didn't break the moment. She let it breathe, and in doing so, she let the country see what accountability looks like when it finally stands eye to eye with power. Then slowly, purposefully, she raised her voice, not in volume, but in clarity, and spoke. "Have you ever stopped to wonder," she asked, her words cutting clean through the tension, "if an ordinary person follows the law to the letter and still loses in court, who failed them? Was it them? Or was it the one interpreting the law?" She didn't move. She didn't blink. And she didn't waver in tone. Her question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't political. It was painfully human. A question rooted in thousands of quiet tragedies. People evicted over paperwork errors, Workers denied claims on technicalities. Voters turned away because of arcane restrictions passed under the banner of integrity, but shaped by bias. People who did everything right and still lost. And there, across from her, sat the man who had made ruling after ruling that allowed those outcomes to stand. Her words weren't just directed at Clarence Thomas, the man. They were directed at Clarence Thomas, the institution, the legacy, the logic, the lifetime appointment. Still, he didn't respond, because there was nothing he could say, not in that moment, not under that image, not in front of a country that had just seen him silenced, not by insult, but by truth. And Jasmine didn't need a reply, because sometimes the absence of a defense is all the proof the world needs. But Jasmine hadn't come just to expose contradictions in legal theory. She came to show how those rulings had already carved themselves into real lives, including her own. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shift in her seat or adopt a more dramatic tone. Instead, she simply let the weight of memory guide her words, slow and deliberate. My mother worked 2 jobs for most of her life, she began, not looking at the screen now, but at him, at Clarence Thomas. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. There was something in its steadiness that made it land harder. She wasn't political. She didn't file lawsuits. She didn't follow court opinions. She was just a woman trying to survive. Jasmine paused, but only for breath. Not to gather composure, but to make room for what came next. She had health insurance for a time. It wasn't great, but it was something. It gave her enough to get her prescriptions, keep her checkups, and then one year she didn't. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. Nothing had changed in her income. She still worked. She still paid taxes. But suddenly she was told she no longer qualified. The room stayed still, the kind of stillness that happens when people realize a story is not abstract, but terrifyingly familiar. She lived in a state that chose not to expand Medicaid after the court allowed them that option. That ruling didn't make headlines in our house, but it made medicine disappear from our kitchen counter. She let that hang in the air for a second, not because she needed sympathy, but because she knew the man across from her had signed the decision that helped make it possible. National Federation of Independent Business versus Sibelius. A decision where the court upheld some parts of the Affordable Care Act, but also gave states the right to opt out of expanding Medicaid. Millions were affected. Her mother was one of them, and Clarence Thomas was one of the justices who wrote it into history. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't break. She just told the truth. My mother didn't get to negotiate with the law, she said, her voice low and unwavering. But you, she continued, her eyes fixed directly on him, you had the power to shape it. There was no accusation in her tone, no plea, just a fact spoken so plainly, so nakedly, it stripped the moment of every layer of legal ceremony. She wasn't speaking for applause or headlines. She was speaking from the exact place the law is supposed to reach, but so often doesn't. And for once, the courtroom wasn't about precedent or theory. It was about a woman who worked hard, followed the rules, and still lost, because a justice had helped give her state permission to look away. That courtroom, once designed to feel untouchable, now felt smaller, quieter. Not because the power in the room had vanished, but because Jasmine had just reminded everyone what real power actually is. The ability to affect lives that will never know your name. And in that moment, Clarence Thomas wasn't being questioned by a colleague. He was being looked in the eye by a daughter. She had spoken from a place no legal theory could touch, truth shaped by harm, memory, and a mother who paid the price for a ruling she never saw coming. And in the silence that followed, the courtroom changed. Not its walls, not its chairs, but its gravity. Because for once, the law wasn't echoing. It was absorbing, and Clarence Thomas, for all his composure, could feel it. He shifted. Not much, but enough. His spine stiffened, his chin lifted half an inch, and the familiar mask slid back into place. The one made of restraint, of dignity, of lifetime appointment. When he finally spoke again, it wasn't explosive, it was controlled. But that control felt defensive, not commanding. Are you implying I have no conscience? He asked. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even a deflection. It was something far rarer from a man who had ruled from behind stone-cold logic for decades. It was personal. The tone wasn't that of a Supreme Court justice pushing back on a legal argument. It was of a man suddenly trying to protect the last fragile thread of moral self-image. The sentence hung in the air, not sharp, but exposed. The weight of it wasn't in its volume. It was in the fact that he had to ask. And Jasmine, steady, composed, utterly clear-eyed, didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't rush. Her answer came like a clean incision. No blood, no dramatics, just undeniable clarity. "I'm implying," she said calmly, her voice like ice cutting through marble, "that conscience cannot exist if it never changes in response to the consequences it creates." The room didn't stir. No sound followed her words. Not a breath, not a shuffle. Even the air seemed suspended, too tense to move. Because that wasn't a soundbite. It was a truth too sharp for politics, too heavy for abstraction. She wasn't accusing him of being heartless. That would have been easy and dismissible. What she did was harder. She pointed to something that couldn't be seen in footnotes or majority opinions. The space between decision and consequence. The distance where conscience is supposed to live. And she was asking, with brutal precision, whether he had ever let consequence re-enter the courtroom once the gavel fell. Because if you write rulings that break people, and you never look at who gets broken, then is it still conscience guiding your hand? Or is it just habit dressed up as principle? She didn't need to say all that. The question had already done the work. And Thomas, for all his composure, could no longer pretend the conversation was still academic. This wasn't about a line in a constitution. This was about a line in the soul, and whether his had ever bent under the weight of what his power had done. No robe could answer that. And so once again, he said nothing. The silence after Jasmine's last words didn't last long, but it lasted long enough. Long enough for the room and the country to understand that Clarence Thomas had no answer for conscience, only distance. And Jasmine, she wasn't finished. Not with her story, not with the truth. She reached for her iPad again, not with hesitation but with intention. The screen behind her went black, then lit up with a simple waveform. No visuals, just the jagged digital line of a voice recording. The room tensed. Even the aides on both sides of the chamber leaned in. Something was coming, and no one, not even Thomas, knew what it was. Then she pressed play. The voice was unmistakable, calm, confident, measured. It was Clarence Thomas. The audio wasn't bombastic. It wasn't dramatic. It was far more dangerous than that. It was casual. "Look, I understand the risk," the voice said low and clear. "But I'm not going to let some lawsuit stop the funding pipeline. Not while I'm still sitting on that bench." There was a pause, then a faint chuckle. Then the voice again, slightly quieter, but even more direct. "I'll handle it. Just keep the money moving." The audio cut off. The waveform disappeared. The silence that returned wasn't curious. It was radioactive. Jasmine didn't look at the room. She didn't look at the press. She looked straight at Thomas. "The recording," she said evenly, "was submitted by an anonymous clerk last month. Verified, time-stamped. A conversation between you and a registered lobbyist, 2 weeks before the court declined to hear Valencia versus Federal Campaign Commission." She paused, but only long enough to let the context land. "That was the case that would have blocked unrestricted dark money from flooding our elections. You refused to grant certiorari. You let it die." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't protest. But something in his body coiled, not in outrage, but in quiet preparation. He sat up straighter, and for a brief second, the old armor returned. "That's a personal conversation," he said firmly. "It has nothing to do with the judicial process." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't deny the recording. He didn't question the evidence. He simply dismissed it, as though the line between power and influence could be drawn neatly in pencil, so easily erased when inconvenient. But Jasmine didn't blink. She took one step forward, not aggressive, not performative, just forward. Her words were steady, slow, sharpened like a blade honed in private grief. "When you're a Supreme Court justice," she said, "there is no such thing as personal. Every word you speak is a ruling on a generation. Her voice didn't rise, but the impact did. It struck not just at Thomas, but at the foundation beneath him. The myth that there was ever such a thing as off the record when your decisions shape the oxygen people breathe. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She didn't need to. Because what she had just done was worse than accusation. She had exposed him, not as corrupt in the legal sense, but as dangerously unaware of the reach of his own voice. She had shown the country what it looks like when the power to interpret the Constitution becomes indistinguishable from the power to protect your allies. And in that courtroom, it wasn't just Jasmine's voice that spoke. It was every citizen who had ever wondered if justice was truly blind, or just too well connected to see. Thomas didn't respond, not because he couldn't, but because anything he said now would only pull the thread further. There was no technicality to hide behind, no precedent to quote, just a raw, uncut truth. He had made a promise behind closed doors, and now it had been dragged into the light, and that light didn't blink. Jasmine stood silent for a breath. Then she looked out, not at the gallery, but just slightly past him, past the marble walls, past the formality. She spoke to the country. To most Americans, she said, the law isn't a debate. It's not an opinion. It's survival. It's whether your kid eats, whether you can vote, whether your mother lives long enough to see a specialist. Her voice softened, but her words landed harder. And when those people hear a justice say, I'll handle it, just keep the money moving, they don't hear policy, they hear betrayal. No one interrupted, not the chairman, not the staffers, not even the stone-faced press who usually found detachment in the mechanical act of transcription. Because everyone in that room, even the ones who had come in expecting performance, knew now that this wasn't a hearing anymore. It was an unveiling, the kind that couldn't be undone. Thomas leaned slightly forward as if readying himself to say something, but the moment passed and he didn't, because no defense could beat a recording of your own voice. No explanation could erase the truth that the law, in the hands of the powerful, had become a private instrument, disguised as public duty. And Jasmine had done what no one before her had managed in such a room. She had shattered the distance between rulings and reality. She had shown the camera, the country, and even the man across from her that the voice of power carries farther than its speaker ever admits. And now that it was no longer private, the burden of consequence was no longer his alone. It belonged to the court, to the people, to history. Because some truths, once heard, don't leave quietly. They echo. And this one was already making its way across the country. The silence that followed the recording was different than any that came before. It was no longer pregnant with anticipation or thick with tension. It was hollow, collapsed. The kind of silence that follows a dam breaking. Not all at once, but in slow, irreversible fractures. And Jasmine Crockett, standing in the center of that courtroom, didn't speak to fill it. She waited. She let the sound of accountability settle like dust on old stone. Clarence Thomas hadn't moved, but everything about him had changed. His spine, once straight as a verdict, now held a slight bend. His hands, which had been so still, now rested on his lap, fingers interlocked but slack. The notebook in front of him, his security blanket of notes, rulings, rehearsed phrases, remained untouched. The pen beside it lay motionless, like even it understood that writing anything now would only deepen the wound. The camera stayed on him, unblinking. Somewhere in a control room, a broadcast producer whispered, "Don't cut," because they all knew. This wasn't coverage. This was history. The most powerful black jurist in the country had just been confronted, publicly, precisely and irrevocably, by a black woman whose only weapon was the truth. And for once, the robe didn't protect him. The marble didn't elevate him. The doctrine didn't defend him. And so Jasmine moved. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her iPad to the table in front of her. Not slammed, not tossed. Placed like the final piece in a trial long overdue. The waveform from the audio recording still lingered behind her, a frozen echo of a voice that could never again pretend to be impartial. Then she looked up, not at the screen, not at the gallery, but at him, at the man who had once been the voice of authority, now reduced to silence by the very weight of his own. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. But it filled the room with the force of something undeniable. "The court is not a shelter for power," she said. "It is the only place where power must kneel before reason." The words hit with such precision they didn't need to be explained. They didn't need context. They were truth at full volume, spoken at a whisper. The kind of truth that doesn't demand applause because its accuracy steals the breath from the room. No one moved, no one blinked, no one dared interrupt what they all knew was the final word. Thomas didn't protest, he didn't defend, he didn't correct her, because there was nothing left to correct. No legal thread to pull, no higher ground to ascend. The mountain had already shifted beneath his feet, and he was no longer standing on it. Instead, without a word, he reached for the notebook that had sat untouched before him. He didn't open it. He didn't write in it. He simply folded it shut, slowly, gently, as if trying not to make a sound, as if aware that even the scrape of paper might echo too loudly now. Then he bowed his head, not dramatically, not performatively, but in the quiet, human way a man does when he knows the truth has finally caught him. Not in fury, in fact, in clarity, in full view of a nation that had long stopped expecting accountability from men in his seat, and was now seeing it not by force but by collapse. And that, more than anything, was what defined the moment. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply accepted that this was not a debate he could win, because this time there were no opinions to write, only consequences to face. Around the room there was no applause, no movement, just reverence, not for the robe but for the rupture, for the fact that, for once, the bench did not rise above the people. It sat with them, silently exposed, and finally small. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her words, "The court is not a shelter for power," now echoed not just in that chamber, but across newsrooms, classrooms, living rooms. Her voice, once dismissed as too direct, too sharp, too much, had done what no headline or hearing had managed to do in decades. Remind the country that power, real power, is measured not in silence, but in what survives it. And today, what survived was not Clarence Thomas's reputation. It was the truth, and the truth had a name. And that name was spoken not in opinion, but in consequence. The moment Clarence Thomas bowed his head, the outside world ignited. What had happened inside the hearing chamber wasn't just watched. It was absorbed, processed, and then released like a shock wave across a nation that hadn't seen accountability walk so plainly into a room of power in decades. It began as a single clip, just 8 seconds long, shared without commentary, showing Thomas with his head lowered and Jasmine Crockett standing across from him, silent, poised, unmoved. That was all it took. Within minutes, the footage was everywhere. It swept through newsrooms, legal circles, high school group chats, veterans forums, state bar associations. It didn't need narration, no music, no pundit overlay. It was the kind of image that spoke for itself, precisely because the man at its center had finally run out of words. CNN's breaking banner read, "Clarence Thomas silent after Crockett's final statement." MSNBC titled it more sharply, "One voice, one question, one collapse." Even Fox News, measured and icy, led with, "Justice Thomas under fire after explosive exchange." But it wasn't the headlines that carried the weight, it was the people. A retired nurse in Detroit posted a freeze frame of Jasmine's final words and wrote, "She spoke like someone who lost someone." That's why it hit. A public defender in Arizona added, "I've never seen a Supreme Court justice fold in real time. Not like that, not without anyone shouting." And a law student at Howard reposted the clip with no caption, just a single line from her professor. "You're watching jurisprudence reckon with its own reflection." By the time Jasmine left the chamber, quietly without statement, the building around her was vibrating with the kind of energy that couldn't be choreographed. Staffers fell silent as she passed. A few nodded. One clutched a case binder to his chest like it might shield him from what he just witnessed. Because the truth wasn't just that Jasmine had won the argument. It was that she had shifted the weight of it onto the court itself, and the court had buckled. The Washington Post front page led with a headline in bold serif: Jasmine Crockett, the woman who put power on the operating table. Within hours, that phrase appeared in broadcast tickers in New York, Atlanta, Denver, and Los Angeles. By nightfall, it ran across a digital marquee above the United Nations building in Geneva. People didn't ask what she said. They asked how she said it, because what Jasmine had done was unlike the theater of politics or the sharp edges of litigation. She had delivered something far rarer in American civic life. She spoke a truth that could not be spun. It was not ideology. It was not partisanship. It was impact, raw, precise, and irreversible. She hadn't accused Thomas of corruption. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't reached for theatrics or headlines. She had simply laid out the record, the pattern, and the pain. And then she'd ended with a single line that would be etched into legal history textbooks for decades. The court is not a shelter for power. It is the only place where power must kneel before reason. That line, delivered without rage, without trembling, became a rallying cry. But not the kind yelled on sidewalks or thrown across congressional aisles. This one traveled differently. It traveled through silence, through respect, through the cold realization that for once, someone had spoken not for the cameras, but past them. By late afternoon, university law schools were organizing emergency panels. The Yale Law Review sent out a public call for essays within hours. NPR's All Things Considered aired a 10-minute feature titled "The Day the Bench Answered Back," with silence. And still, Jasmine said nothing. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't tweet. She didn't even issue a formal statement. Her aides fielded over 300 interview requests in the first 6 hours. Her office declined every single one. She hadn't come for cameras. She hadn't come for virality. She had come because something had broken. And no one inside that courtroom had wanted to name it until now. The country, however, had no such restraint. Civil rights organizations began circulating petitions demanding that the ethics code for Supreme Court justices be not just strengthened, but enforced. Think pieces poured in from both liberal and conservative legal scholars, some defending Thomas's right to privacy, others pointing to the moment as evidence of systemic decay. But most people didn't need footnotes. They'd heard enough. What Jasmine had done wasn't expose a man. She had exposed a pattern, and she had done it with a clarity that made denial impossible. Late into the night, a teacher in Philadelphia asked her students to watch the final 10 minutes of the hearing and write a single sentence describing what they felt. One student, a 17-year-old whose father had lost his job after being misclassified as a contractor, wrote, "For the first time, it felt like the law could hear me back." It wasn't a courtroom anymore. It had become a mirror. A mural went up the next morning in West Oakland, uncommissioned, unannounced. It showed the scales of justice tilting right, with a single fingertip pressing gently to the other side. The caption, painted in brushstroke red beneath it, read, "She didn't break the scales. She revealed the weight." Even those who disagreed with her politics found themselves unable to deny the power of what had happened. One conservative columnist wrote, "You don't have to like her, but you have to admit, he had no answer." And the silence became the proof. Because for a man who had shaped generations of law, Clarence Thomas hadn't even tried to reshape what happened. He hadn't rebutted. He hadn't spun. He hadn't summoned the language of dignity or originalism or constitutional decorum. He had closed his notebook and bowed his head. Not because he lost the argument, because he had nothing left to say. And Jasmine Crockett, she had said enough. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask for permission. She simply made power answer. And for the first time in a very long time, the country realized that sometimes the most radical act in democracy isn't a protest, a leak, or a scandal. It's a sentence, delivered at the right moment, to the right man, in the one room he thought would always protect him. And when that sentence lands, there's no need to raise your voice, because the silence that follows will be louder than anything that came before. While the headlines screamed and the feeds lit up, Jasmine disappeared. Not physically, she still walked the same halls, took the same meetings, showed up to vote, but she was gone from the frenzy. CNN called. NBC offered a primetime sit-down. NPR requested an exclusive. Even international outlets, The Guardian, Le Monde, Al Jazeera, asked for her voice. They wanted to know how it felt to do what no one else had. Silence a Supreme Court justice without a single insult or raised voice. But Jasmine declined them all. She didn't need a microphone. She'd already said what mattered. And deep down, she knew something the rest of the country hadn't yet caught up to. This wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning. The Capitol buzzed with speculation. Was she afraid? Was she negotiating something behind closed doors? But those who knew her understood. Jasmine wasn't hiding. She was letting the silence do its work. She had spent her energy not on performance, but precision, and that kind of truth doesn't need a victory lap. Still, the storm had changed her orbit. People stared longer in elevators. Junior staffers lowered their voices when she passed. And in committee meetings, colleagues who used to talk over her now waited half a beat before interrupting, just long enough to prove they were listening. But Jasmine hadn't come for respect. She had come for accountability. And so when Howard University asked her to speak, no cameras, no stage, just a small closed-door Q&A with law students, she accepted. Not because she owed them anything, but because that room, those students, were the exact people the law was supposed to serve next. And because someone in that crowd might one day sit behind the same bench Clarence Thomas had just lowered his head upon. It was a warm afternoon, the air thick with post-rain humidity, the kind that sticks to your collar and makes even polished buildings feel a little more real. The lecture hall was simple. High ceilings, scuffed floors, a chalkboard still streaked with faint equations from a prior class. There were no press passes, no podium, just rows of chairs, arranged in a quiet half circle, and one folding table with a pitcher of water and two glasses. Jasmine sat at the center. She wore navy, clean, sharp, quiet. No emerald blazer this time, no iPad, just a notebook with no writing in it, and the stillness of someone who had stopped chasing the moment and started letting it settle. The students were electric with energy, but polite. One by one, they asked questions about constitutional interpretation, about how to survive in spaces designed to erase you, about how she prepared for someone like Thomas. Jasmine answered each one carefully. Not as a politician, not as a performer, but as someone who had walked into fire and come back quieter, not louder. Then a young man in the back stood up, maybe 21, maybe less. Dressed in a black hoodie with the sleeves pushed halfway to the elbows, a backpack still slung over one shoulder. His voice wasn't nervous. It was curious, honest. "Do you think you won?" he asked. There was a pause, not from hesitation, but from choice. Jasmine looked at him, looked around the room, then finally looked down at the glass of water in front of her. She didn't smile. She didn't shake her head. She just told the truth. "No," she said, "I don't think I won. I just helped him look in a mirror, if there's still any part of him left that wants to look." The room fell completely still, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. There was no bitterness, no pride, just a kind of quiet ache that came from recognizing the difference between confrontation and change. She hadn't gone into that hearing to defeat Clarence Thomas. That would have been too small a goal. She went in to make visible what power always tries to keep invisible: its own consequences, its fingerprints, its echoes, and maybe, just maybe, to remind one man that even the law cannot hide from its own reflection forever. She took a sip of water. The sound of her glass touching the table was the only thing audible. Then she continued. "I wasn't there to destroy him," she said. "I was there to dismantle the distance between his rulings and our lives. That distance is where injustice hides. And I needed him to see it, even if just for a second, even if he pretends tomorrow that he didn't." The students didn't ask another question for a full minute, because that was the answer. Not just to the students' question, but to the entire country's reaction. The headlines had called it a takedown, a cross-examination, a power shift. But Jasmine hadn't come to play courtroom chess. She had come to restore something that had been bleeding under the surface of legal language for too long: truth. And truth, when delivered without malice, is sometimes the most dangerous thing of all. After the session ended, students lined up to shake her hand. Some cried, some said nothing. A few hugged her like she had spoken to something their own families hadn't been able to name. And Jasmine received each gesture with the same quiet focus she had brought into the chamber. Outside, the sky had gone gray again. Rain coming. She stepped through the front doors alone. No entourage, no car waiting with an open door. Just a woman in navy walking slowly across the courtyard of a school that had taught America more about justice than half its legislatures combined. A woman who hadn't come to win. She'd come to make sure power finally had to see its own shadow. And somewhere, far from the microphones, Clarence Thomas, still cloaked in silence, had to sit with that reflection, whether he ever admitted it or not. The country didn't change overnight, but something had shifted. And for once, it didn't shift in silence. A year had passed since the day the cameras froze. The gavel fell quiet, and Clarence Thomas closed his notebook with nothing left to say. The storm that Jasmine Crockett set in motion hadn't burned out. It had spread, quietly, relentlessly, from living rooms to lecture halls, from law schools to legislative offices. The question she left hanging in the air refused to die. Who watches the ones who interpret the law? And eventually someone answered. It began with a whisper inside a bipartisan caucus. Just a draft resolution tucked into a manila folder, labeled Judicial Ethics Transparency Initiative. Most thought it would be gutted in committee, but the public wouldn't let go. Protesters didn't carry signs. They carried court decisions, stapled and highlighted, with handwritten notes like, "My father lost his pension because of this, and this one took my vote." Senators, long used to shrugging off judicial opacity, found themselves cornered in airports and coffee shops, asked not about tax rates or infrastructure, but about judicial disclosure. 3 months later, it passed, by a vote wider than expected. The bill created the first independent judicial ethics commission in U.S. history, empowered to audit, investigate, and publicly report the financial entanglements of every federal judge, including those on the Supreme Court. Gifts, real estate, luxury trips, quiet financial ties to lobbying arms. All of it now subject to daylight, and something about that light, blistering, overdue, began to bend the system. The commission didn't arrive quietly. It arrived with subpoenas, and the questions that followed weren't whispered in academic panels anymore. They were shouted across dinner tables, posted above the fold, asked by cab drivers and librarians alike. Can the law still be trusted when its interpreters hide behind closed doors? And more hauntingly, if a justice can be bought, what happens to the justice I was promised? The court didn't collapse. It didn't need to. It recalibrated, because now it had to answer to a country that had finally learned to ask. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. She didn't run for office, though more than one party tried to court her. She didn't write a book, though publishers lined up with offers, one after another. There were no interviews, no speaking tours, no op-eds. Her staff said she'd returned to committee work, that she still walked to her office early, that she still read case files at midnight and asked the same impossible questions she always had. But in the places that mattered, her presence was everywhere. In Georgia, a public defender held a town hall holding up a printout of her quote, "The court is not a shelter for power. It's the one place where power must kneel before reason." In New Mexico, a third-year law student opened her final thesis with an entire chapter on what Crockett's hearing had done to shift public trust. In Ohio, a judge cited her exchange with Thomas in his ruling against a corporate immunity claim. And in California, a high school senior told his graduation class that he planned to go into law, not because he believed it was pure, but because she had proved it could still be held accountable. But the most enduring mark didn't come in applause or citations. It came in stone. A year to the day after the hearing, a modest ceremony was held at the University of Texas School of Law. No broadcasts, no ribbon cutting, just a few hundred students, a few former clerks, and a handful of professors who had taught constitutional law long enough to know what had just passed through the country's bloodstream. They unveiled a newly renovated reading room, sunlight pouring in through floor-to-ceiling windows, surrounded by shelves lined with case books, landmark rulings, and volumes on judicial ethics. In the center of the far wall, Carved into Texas limestone were 10 words, not a title, not a plaque, just a sentence. Justice is not written, it is witnessed. No name followed, none was needed. The room already bore hers, because by now everyone understood. Jasmine Crockett hadn't tried to dismantle the system, she had forced it to see itself. She hadn't thrown fire, she'd held up a mirror, and from that reflection came more than shame. It came change. The kind of change that can't be undone in a single vote or buried in procedure. The kind of change that outlives headlines and settles instead into the national memory like sediment. Quiet, heavy, permanent. Clarence Thomas never addressed the hearing publicly. He returned to his duties, but something about him had shifted too. The same unwavering style, the same sharp questions. But there was a restraint now, a slight pause before dissent, a growing pile of recusals. He wrote less, and when he did write, it lacked the certainty that once defined his tone. He had not been removed, he had not been disbarred. But in the court of public trust, something had been severed. And maybe that was the point. Jasmine Crockett had never asked to win. She asked only that the people see. That power no longer operate in darkness. That the decisions carved into public life reflect the public's right to witness. Not just what is done, but who is doing it and why. And now a country that had once watched the court from a respectful distance had learned to lean closer. Because once you've seen a robe lower its head, you never look at power the same way again. And once you've heard a woman say, "I wasn't there to win, I was there to help him look in the mirror," you start asking how many others need to look too. That's how justice moves. Not always in triumph, but in truth. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a sealed congressional chamber, Jasmine Crockett is forced to confront Byron Donalds, once her political rival, now the key figure in a federal investigation into a multi-million-dollar financial fraud. He thought the hearing would be routine. He didn't know she held encrypted files that exposed a 7-year scheme of falsified tax records and inflated loan documents. All signed by him. Allies abandon him. The walls close in. And the woman he tried to dismiss becomes the one voice that can bring it all crashing down. When truth tears through the walls of Washington, who's next? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber inside the Capitol was cold, intentionally cold. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Byron Donalds pushed open the double doors, walking in like a man arriving at his own coronation. His sapphire blue suit caught the light like armor, a pointed signal that he didn't come to answer questions. He came to dominate. He flashed a grin, not at the camera crews, because this was a closed hearing, but at the familiar faces of Republican allies lining the far wall. He nodded toward them like a quarterback entering a home game, then locked eyes with the committee chair, offering a smirk as he mouthed, "This won't take long." And then, without invitation or urgency, he turned deliberately toward Jasmine Crockett, his voice low enough for only the closest mic to catch it. "Didn't expect you to still be here." The comment landed with calculated venom, a not-so-subtle reminder of the room's hierarchy. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Jasmine Crockett sat at the far end of the U-shaped dais, shoulders back, spine straight, dressed in a tailored black suit that made no concessions to fashion or friendliness. Every move was measured, not for show but for strategy. Because while the media had described Byron as a voluntary witness, those of us who understood the real stakes knew better. This wasn't a hearing, it was an extraction. Beneath the veneer of order and protocol was a silent war, one waged in documents, signatures, and a 7-year trail of financial deceit that had slipped past watchdogs until now. And Jasmine? She wasn't here to ask politely. She was here to dismantle a system that had been weaponized against people like her, quietly, legally, cruelly. Every moment Byron grinned was a reminder. Privilege enters every room assuming it owns the oxygen. But Jasmine Crockett had come to reclaim the air. He mistook her silence for weakness. a miscalculation that would soon shatter the air of control he thought he owned. Byron Donald sat with the comfort of a man who had rehearsed every moment of his appearance, not with the humility of a witness, but with the smug cadence of someone who had always been allowed to talk louder, arrive later, and walk away cleaner. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the dark wood of the desk, not out of anxiety but out of timing. He was waiting for his turn to speak, not because he had something urgent to say, but because he knew the spotlight would find him eventually. And when it did, he leaned in with the practiced posture of a man who'd been told all his life that charisma could outpace scrutiny. His tie was perfectly centered, his pin glinting beneath the overhead lights, his voice warm enough to feel like reason, and detached enough to evade accountability. He glanced toward his allies in the room, letting his expression shift from neutral to amused. They responded with shallow nods and smirks, silent affirmations from those who'd spent careers swapping truth for performance. "Let me be clear," Byron said, settling back as if the room itself worked for him. "I'm here because I respect the process, not because I have anything to be concerned about." His words rolled out with polished ease, but they weren't meant for clarity. They were armor. With a slight, exaggerated motion, he dropped a manila folder onto the table with a practiced thud. Inside was a meticulously curated set of documents: tax filings, campaign finance reports, memoranda, quarterly audits, all clipped, tabbed, and arranged to suggest transparency. The formatting was pristine: legal headers, numbered exhibits, and footnotes so dense they blurred into noise. Some pages were aggressively redacted in thick black ink, others filled with jargon and references to obscure procedural codes. Every spreadsheet was clean, too clean: rounded numbers, projected estimates, advisory adjustments. It was the kind of packet designed not to explain but to exhaust, the kind of compliance that wore a suit and tie and called itself accountability while hoping no one would read past page 3. "All financial disclosures have been filed properly and reviewed thoroughly," he continued, lifting his chin as if the weight of proof had already shifted onto someone else's shoulders. To the untrained ear, it sounded like professionalism, but to anyone who had ever been forced to defend their existence with perfect paperwork, it was a masterclass in how power could dress itself in compliance and still be hiding something. Byron didn't come to cooperate. He came to assert. His words were less testimony and more declaration. A reminder that for people like him, hearings were stages, not courts. And yet, even as he spoke, something flickered behind his eyes. A calculation, a doubt. Because across the table, Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She hadn't scribbled a note, whispered to an aide, or reached for a microphone. She had simply watched, not with curiosity, but with certainty. And that certainty unsettled him more than any accusation could. And then Jasmine Crockett spoke, quietly, deliberately. No theatrics, no raised voice, just the blade of truth slipped between layers of arrogance. "Congressman Donalds," she said, her gaze lifting for the first time, locking onto his with unsettling precision, "are you certain that every document you've just submitted has been reviewed by counsel?" The sentence was calm, unhurried, but it didn't land like a question. It landed like the beginning of a controlled detonation. The pause that followed was neither awkward nor accidental. It was engineered, built to let the weight of her words settle in the bones of everyone in that room. It was the kind of pause that made people forget how to breathe, not because they feared what had been said, but because they feared what hadn't been said yet. For a man like Byron, who had always equated volume with dominance, the silence was foreign territory. He shifted slightly in his chair. Not much, just enough for those paying attention to know he felt it. He felt her. And for the first time in the hearing, he wasn't performing. He was calculating. What Jasmine had done in a single sentence wasn't just challenge a claim. It was to signal that she had read everything, that she had seen everything, that the truth wasn't buried in a stack of documents, because the truth was already in the room, staring back at him. Byron's silence hadn't yet collapsed into panic, but what came next would make the air itself feel heavier. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, pound the table, or ask for permission. She simply tapped the screen of her encrypted tablet once, then again. On the monitor behind her, a single email appeared, blown up in high resolution, the subject line reading, Asset Adjustment, Q3. The room stilled. It wasn't the kind of document typically shared in hearings. This one had metadata, internal routing codes, and, most damningly, the name B. Donalds on the directive line. Her voice remained steady as she narrated, each word landing like a gavel. This email was obtained through a protected whistleblower channel and independently decrypted by the Office of Congressional Oversight's Forensic Unit. She let that sink in. The sender, a senior financial officer in Mr. Donalds' business network, was instructed to reduce the declared market value of several commercial properties ahead of filing with the IRS, dropping valuations by up to 62% in order to minimize property taxes and capital gains exposure. The word reduce hung in the air like a blade, surgical, cold, deliberate. Jasmine stepped aside so the screen could be seen clearly. "I'm not alleging anything," she said flatly. "I'm showing you what you signed." Byron didn't move, not a muscle, but the bravado was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt brittle, artificial. He reached forward, slow and stiff, as if by adjusting his microphone he could shift the weight of the evidence, now crashing down around him. A murmur rippled through the room, not from Jasmine's side but his. Staffers exchanged glances. The Republican counsel leaned forward slightly, pen frozen above paper. Jasmine took one step closer, her heels clicking like a metronome. "We all know the difference between a tax strategy and a tax dodge," she said, turning briefly toward the committee chair before returning her gaze to Byron. "What's displayed here isn't creative accounting. It's a blueprint for deception. Signed, dated, authorized." She clicked again, and a second email appeared. Same sender, same instruction, same digital fingerprint. The only thing louder than the image on the screen was the sound of privilege being peeled back, one document at a time. But privilege doesn't surrender quietly. It fights back with denial, even when the walls are closing in. Byron jolted forward in his chair, the sharp scrape of metal legs against marble tiles slicing through the silence like a warning shot. His voice came hard and loud, not composed but strained, brittle at the edges. "That email is fabricated," he snapped, his tone climbing over the weight of the evidence just presented. "Anyone can spoof a document these days. This is a political stunt." The words landed with the hollow ring of rehearsed outrage, not righteous defense. His fingers curled into fists on the table, knuckles pale against the burnished wood. But his eyes, those betrayed him. They scanned the room with a flicker of panic thinly disguised as defiance, searching for affirmation, for some sign of retreat from the storm Jasmine Crockett had just unleashed. But there was none. His allies sat still, their pens unmoving, their expressions unreadable, because even they knew what came next. The tempo had changed. The theater was over. The prosecution had begun. Crockett didn't move. Her expression remained undisturbed, untouched by the volume of his denial or the familiar tactic behind it. She'd seen it before, in courtrooms, in hearing rooms, in every space where truth met entitlement. She didn't respond with outrage. She didn't need to. Instead, with the calm of someone who had built the moment piece by piece, hour by hour, year by year, she reached forward and tapped the tablet resting on her desk. No preamble, no warning, just the quiet authority of certainty. From the speakers embedded in the chamber walls, his voice poured out, not in testimony, but in casual conversation, captured, preserved, undeniable. "Byron, change the numbers. IRS doesn't check these that hard." The words sliced through the air with mechanical clarity, each syllable striking the room like a hammer. There was no background noise, no ambiguity, no editing. Just his voice, plain, polished, and damning. For a moment, time seemed to pause. No one breathed. No one looked away. Even Byron stopped blinking, as if his body understood what his pride refused to accept. The arrogance drained from his face slowly, like color from paper under flame. He leaned back, but it wasn't out of confidence this time. It was retreat, silent, shaken. Crockett stepped away from her desk, not to approach him, but to give the truth room to echo. She folded her arms, measured, unfazed, allowing the clip to settle like dust in a sealed vault. Then she spoke, not loudly, not with anger, but with the weight of something deeper: clarity. "Spoofed," she said, her eyes never leaving him. "Because that sounds a lot like you." Her voice didn't accuse. It confirmed. It didn't shout. It sliced. And in that instant, it became achingly clear to everyone watching, not just in the room but beyond it, that this was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning. But Crockett wasn't finished. She hadn't come for a single blow. She came to dismantle the entire facade, piece by piece, until nothing was left standing but the truth. She stepped forward, not rushed, not theatrical, but with the quiet certainty of someone holding a loaded file folder of reality. With a single press on her tablet, the chamber lights dimmed slightly as the hearing room screen flickered to life. The image that appeared wasn't dramatic at first glance. Just two columns of numbers projected side by side in stark black and white. But those numbers were nuclear. On the left, a list of commercial assets submitted as part of a loan application, values bloated like corpses in the sun. $18.6 million for a property in Miami that hadn't been renovated in 6 years. $23.1 million for a corporate suite whose roof had leaked since 2019. $47.8 million for a commercial lot that had sat half vacant for over a decade. And on the right, those same properties, same addresses, submitted for tax assessment just weeks apart, each value slashed nearly in half. It wasn't rounding error. It was strategy, weaponized valuation. Crockett didn't point. She didn't need to. She simply spoke. "These aren't discrepancies," she said, her tone as controlled as a courtroom cross-exam. "They're design distortions. Value when it's convenient, loss when it's strategic." The words landed hard, not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable. There were no abstract theories here, no ideological smokescreens. Just arithmetic, signatures, and timing. Facts that had been hidden in plain sight until now. She zoomed in. The chamber screen shifted with surgical precision to the lower section of the documents. Byron Donald's signature. Neat, unhurried, nearly identical on both columns. The same pen stroke, the same man, the same lie, divided only by who was asking. Same property, same date, same signer. She paused, not to dramatize, but to allow the silence to carry the weight her voice didn't need to. In the stillness that followed, every listener was invited into the discomfort, into the truth, into the realization that this wasn't some partisan squabble. It was something older, deeper, the machinery of privilege, finely tuned to exploit the cracks no one else could afford to fall through. And then came the pivot, the kind that didn't raise the stakes. It detonated them. "Exhibit G," she said. There was a beat, then the screen went black. A few murmurs started, but were instantly hushed as the screen flared back to life. The image this time was unmistakably different. This wasn't a spreadsheet. It was video, surveillance footage, time-stamped, raw, and chilling in its clarity. A modern boardroom appeared, clean, sterile, the kind built to insulate wealth from the consequences of decision-making. Byron Donald sat at the head of the table, jacket off, sleeves rolled, a red pen in his hand. Two other men flanked him, both in tailored suits, eyes lowered, laptops open. A whiteboard to the side read in faint scrawl, Q3 asset adjustments, targets and exposure. There was no sound, but the motion was unmistakable. Byron circled a number on the document in front of him. He slashed through a second. He tapped the margin of a column labeled Loan Collateral Revalue, then pointed sharply at another column marked Depreciation Forecast. He wasn't observing. He was orchestrating. Even in silence, he was issuing instructions. Crockett didn't speak immediately. She let the image sit. Let it breathe. Let the weight of what it meant settle into the bones of the room like cold iron. Then she spoke, clear, direct, and unshaken. "This is from a financial strategy session recorded by his own team, obtained legally through subpoena. No one moved. No one dared. Because that sentence, so matter-of-fact, cut through every ounce of plausible deniability. This wasn't third hand. This wasn't conjecture. It wasn't even leaked. It was legally obtained, internally recorded proof that the man sitting across from her wasn't a victim of political persecution, but the architect of a deliberate, calculated financial shell game. And then the room reacted, not all at once, not dramatically, but in a slow, organic wave of discomfort that began on the Republican side of the dais and crept outward like water, finding a crack in concrete. A staffer 2 rows behind Byron leaned into her colleague's ear, eyes wide. A senior legal aide pinched the bridge of his nose and looked down at his notes as if they were suddenly indecipherable. A member of the committee glanced at the screen, then at Byron, then back again. His jaw clenched, lips thin and bloodless. Even the stenographer's fingers hesitated for a beat, as if unsure whether to capture what they were now hearing or witnessing. The whispers were soft but charged, not like the idle noise of a political performance, but the low-frequency panic of people realizing they're on the wrong side of something they can't spin. And still, Crockett didn't flinch. She stepped forward, slow and controlled, her hands behind her back, like a prosecutor in closing arguments. Not out for spectacle, but for record. "We all know the difference between a tax strategy and a tax dodge," she said, her eyes scanning the room but landing firmly back on Byron. "What's displayed here isn't creative accounting. It's a blueprint for deception. Signed, dated, authorized." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She tapped the tablet again. Another email appeared, this one even colder. The subject line, "Reconsolidation format for IRS submission." The body was short, "Director." From the same financial officer as before, it read, "Please confirm, adjust down to $44.9 million for tax. Keep lender copy at original valuation." The room went dead quiet. This wasn't interpretation. This wasn't messaging. This was proof. Black text, white screen, and a digital signature that matched the one now turning Byron's collar, visibly damp with sweat. She didn't gloat. She didn't posture. Because she didn't need to be the loudest in the room. The documents were speaking louder than any voice ever could. Somewhere near the back of the chamber, a reporter quietly stood up and left, phone already out, thumbs moving fast. At least one Senate staffer was already texting under the table. One congressman scribbled something on a post-it and passed it without making eye contact. And Byron? He sat frozen. His fingers twitched once near the microphone, but he didn't reach for it. His face, so composed earlier, now bore the taut, pale expression of someone still trying to calculate a defense that no longer existed. He wasn't just losing control. He was watching control dissolve, pixel by pixel, on a screen he could no longer deny. The facts had already cut deep, but what came next reached for something more fragile than numbers, the myth he had built around himself. Crockett leaned forward, not with aggression, but with intent, as if lowering her voice would somehow make the truth echo louder. She had struck him with evidence, and it had landed. But now she reached into a space no document could shield. No lawyer could redact, no PR team could reframe. Her expression remained unreadable, but her voice softened just enough to disarm. "Congressman Donalds," she said, the words deliberate, even, but aimed like a scalpel. "Have you ever felt that the expectations placed on you by your family were a burden?" The question didn't explode. It didn't need to. It slipped beneath the surface like a slow-rising leak, silent but unstoppable. The hearing room, filled with spreadsheets, legal jargon, and party allegiances, was suddenly still. The transformation was immediate. What had been a battle of compliance had become something intimate, uncomfortable, human. Byron's eyes twitched, just barely. The change was small, almost imperceptible, but it said more than any statement he'd delivered all day. His mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but no words came. The pause that followed wasn't calculated like before. It was involuntary, unrehearsed. His gaze dropped, not in submission, but in evasion, scanning the desk in front of him as though a script might appear from beneath the wood grain. It didn't. And then his right hand moved, slowly, toward the glass of water positioned inches from his nameplate. It was a reflex more than a choice, a gesture of self-preservation in a room where oxygen had suddenly thinned. His fingers curled around the stem of the glass with deliberate care, too deliberate, and as he lifted it, the motion betrayed him. The water sloshed gently against the sides, and the subtle tremble in his wrist made it ripple like a seismograph, picking up a distant quake. The ice clinked softly against the rim. He took a sip, then held the glass there, hovering near his lips longer than necessary, as if hoping the delay might pass for composure. It didn't. Crockett didn't speak. She didn't follow the question with a barrage, because she knew she didn't need to. The silence that followed was not a vacuum. It was a crucible. And in that silence, Byron Donalds, congressman, financier, heir to legacy and expectation, sat exposed. Not by evidence, not by accusation, but by something much harder to outrun. The fracture between who he was and who he'd been told to be. The cameras didn't zoom, the microphones didn't crackle, but for anyone paying attention, not just in that room, but across every screen where the footage would be dissected later, this was the moment that would define him. Not the charts, not the paper trail, not even the tape. This, the moment when silence became confession. Because that wasn't a question he'd expected. It wasn't in his notes. It wasn't part of the strategy memo his staff had drafted. It wasn't bullet-pointed in the binder now sitting idle in front of him. It wasn't fair, by the standards he'd grown up with, where power was never questioned and vulnerability was for the poor. And yet here it was, 5 simple words that unraveled everything. Have you ever felt that the expectations placed on you by your family were a burden? 1,000 echoes trailed it, none spoken aloud but all deafening. The privilege of performance, the pressure to embody an image, the unspoken rule that success had to be perfect, polished, impenetrable. That failure wasn't just personal. It was betrayal, not of law, of lineage. Crockett knew this terrain. She had seen it before, not in hearings but in the spaces between power and pretense. The quiet breakdown behind the titles. The weight of legacies inherited but never earned. And she understood that this wasn't about making Byron cry. It was about showing that even the men most insulated by status carried cracks too deep for wealth to seal. The room remained silent, but it wasn't empty. The tension had changed shape, from confrontation to observation. Staffers who had been typing seconds before were now still. One congresswoman on the right side of the aisle had put her pen down completely. A young aide near the back had stopped taking notes altogether, just staring forward, lips parted. Even the court reporter's rhythm slowed, not paused but tentative, as though trying to transcribe something that wasn't being said. And Byron? He set the water down, carefully now, but slower than before. His fingers lingered on the base, anchoring to something physical as if to steady what was unraveling internally. He didn't answer. Couldn't. Because the answer wasn't meant to be spoken, it was meant to be seen. His shoulders, once squared with confidence, now sat slightly uneven. His jaw, once set like stone, now shifted as if grinding against itself. He adjusted his cuff, another reflex, a man trying to fix his sleeve when the damage was under his skin. And his eyes, once sharp and scanning, now avoided contact, not just with Jasmine, but with the room, with himself. He had spoken all day, with certainty, with confidence, with charm. But now at the simplest question, the one no spreadsheet could protect against, he said nothing. And in that silence, everything changed. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't lean back in victory, because this wasn't about winning. This was about revealing. She had peeled away the defenses of numbers, the armor of wealth, the shield of inherited power. And what stood behind it wasn't a criminal mastermind. It was a man trapped by the very privilege he used as protection. A man conditioned to perform strength at all costs, but unprepared for the quiet, surgical confrontation of truth. Her question wasn't a dagger. It was a mirror. And in that reflection, Byron Donalds wasn't a leader or a legacy. He was just human, flawed, fractured, caught between who he claimed to be and who he feared he wasn't. And Jasmine Crockett, still seated, still silent, had made the entire country watch him see it too. The silence was stretching thin, the weight of Crockett's last question still pressing down, when a new presence entered the room and rewrote the rules completely. The side door opened, quietly but not discreetly. The sound was subtle, mechanical, almost sterile, but its effect on the chamber was immediate and unmistakable. Every head turned. Conversations froze mid-whisper. Pens stopped mid-sentence. Even the stenographer hesitated. Two federal agents in plain suits stepped into the room, not aggressively, but with unmistakable authority, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice to command attention. And between them stood a woman, thin, composed. Every step forward she took was measured, precise. Her black blazer hung stiffly from her frame, and her eyes scanned the room not with fear, but with absolute focus, like someone who had rehearsed this walk in her head 100 times and had now finally stepped into it. Her name appeared on the committee record a beat later, Jessica Linwood, former senior finance controller for the Byron Donalds Foundation, a title now drenched in implications. She didn't glance at Byron, not once. She kept her gaze locked on the raised dais, on Jasmine Crockett, and in her left hand, gloved and steady, she held a small, silver hard drive case no larger than a clutch purse. But its weight wasn't physical, it was evidentiary. A decade's worth of secrets sat in her palm, and she carried them like a final act. Byron shifted. It was the first real movement he'd made in minutes, and it wasn't confident. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing, not in recognition, but in dread. Because Jessica wasn't an outsider. She wasn't a name in a footnote or a blurred face behind a spreadsheet. She had been in the room, she had signed the checks, she had built the firewalls, and now she had walked straight through them. Jasmine remained motionless, but her voice cut through the stillness with the same unwavering calm that had dismantled everything so far. "Ms. Linwood," she said, "thank you for joining us today. Do you have something you wish to submit to the committee?" Jessica stepped forward and placed the hard case on the evidence table. The metallic snap of its latch echoed like a gunshot in a church. "Yes," she said, her voice steady but brittle, the kind of steadiness that comes after too many sleepless nights and one irreversible decision. Inside is a mirrored archive of all internal accounting systems and communication logs from the last 7 fiscal years, separated by project, shell entity, and valuation tier. Her words were clinical, efficient, devoid of drama, but they landed like punches. It contains every instance of double ledger entries, undocumented asset transfers, and what Mr. Donald's internal team referred to as adaptive equity flow protocols, which, to be clear, is a euphemism for falsified financial positioning. The room didn't move. Couldn't. A congressman to Byron's left let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. An aide clutched their tablet a little tighter. One of the FBI agents behind Jessica folded their hands in front of them like they already knew how this would end. But it wasn't over. Not yet. One of the committee members cleared his throat, then asked the question hanging like static in the air. "Ms. Linwood, may we ask, what made you come forward?" Jessica turned slowly, for the first time acknowledging the audience beyond Crockett. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes glistened. Not with fear, but with finality. "For over 6 years, I buried what I saw," she said. "I convinced myself that exposure would only destroy me, that there wasn't a system strong enough to protect someone like me. I watched colleagues get threatened, relocated, paid off. I watched whistleblowers disappear behind NDAs and sealed settlements. I was afraid." She paused just long enough to let the words settle, not to earn sympathy, to reclaim power. "And then," she said, "someone reached out, not to offer protection, but to listen." She turned toward Jasmine. The only person who believed me was her. The room shifted again, not physically but emotionally, because now it wasn't just evidence on display. It was humanity, risk, trust, and sacrifice. Jessica Linwood wasn't just a witness. She was the living embodiment of everything the system tried to silence. And Jasmine Crockett, underestimated, dismissed, doubted, had done what no compliance officer, no investigative journalist, no federal agency had managed to do in nearly a decade. She'd made someone feel safe enough to speak. Byron's face was pale now, not from rage or frustration, but from something colder: inevitability. His hands fidgeted near the microphone as if searching for a statement, a phrase, a pretext that could undo what just happened. But there was nothing left to pivot to. Not when the dam had cracked from the inside. Jessica returned to her seat beside the agents, her posture upright but her breathing more visible now, as though exhaling for the first time in years. She didn't look at Byron again. She didn't need to. And Jasmine? She didn't speak either, because some moments don't need amplification. They just need silence, so the truth can echo all the way to the ceiling. The air was already heavy with consequence, but betrayal, when it comes from your own side, doesn't just cut, it collapses everything. It started with the soft scrape of a chair leg. No one spoke, no one moved, but the sound was unmistakable. One of the leather-bound seats near the center of the dais shifting slightly as its occupant stood. All eyes turned, not toward Byron, not toward Jasmine, but toward the speaker, Representative Colby Reardon, Republican of Ohio, a longtime party stalwart, a man known for his sharp suits, sharper elbows, and an unbroken record of voting in lockstep with Byron Donalds on nearly every key issue in the last 5 years. He had been photographed at fundraisers beside him, co-sponsored legislation with him, defended him on national television. And now he was standing. Reardon cleared his throat, but it wasn't to stall, it was to steady. His face, usually taut with political calculation, now looked worn, human, the kind of look that comes after nights without sleep and decisions that can't be undone. His eyes flicked toward Byron for a half second, just enough to register recognition and regret. "Madam Chair," he began, addressing the room with a voice that quivered just beneath the surface. "I would like to formally request recognition to make a personal statement for the record." No one stopped him. No one dared. Reardon adjusted his tie, another reflex, but his hands betrayed him. They weren't shaking, but they weren't steady either. He glanced once at the nameplate in front of him, as if checking whether it still belonged to him. "I have served on this committee for 8 years, he said, voice louder now, gathering force. "I have defended colleagues. I have given benefit of the doubt. I have believed, sometimes against better judgment, in the loyalty of men I thought shared my values." Byron didn't move, but the tension in his jaw was visible now, a clenched line that had lost all smugness. There was no reaction in his eyes, just a flat stare trained on the wood grain of the desk in front of him. Reardon's next words landed like gunfire in a cathedral. "2 months ago, Congressman Byron Donalds approached me privately. He asked if I would vote against an internal motion to open a financial oversight subcommittee investigation, an investigation that would have included his name." Reardon's voice didn't break. It hardened. "He told me, quote, if you kill it in the room, I'll make sure your re-election coffers are topped off through Q4. You'll never have to ask again." The room gasped, not loud, not chaotic, but sharp, collective. A breath sucked inward across the rows like a ripple in steel. Reardon continued, "I considered staying silent. I did. I convinced myself that loyalty meant shielding people when they fall. But loyalty, Madam Chair, is not the same as complicity, and I will not wear silence as armor while this chamber is turned into a laundering machine for power and privilege." Someone in the gallery dropped a pen. The sound echoed louder than expected. Crockett hadn't moved. Not once. Her face was a mask, not of neutrality, but of control, of awareness. Her eyes remained fixed on Byron, not blinking, not shifting, just watching, waiting, because she knew. She had known. Reardon took his seat again without another word. His nameplate trembled slightly as his elbow brushed the table, but the silence that followed did not. It was absolute, dense, the kind of silence that suffocates before it speaks. Byron stared ahead, his mouth tightened. He reached again for the glass of water, but stopped halfway and let his hand fall back to the table, fingers curling as if they no longer trusted themselves. He didn't look at Reardon. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at anyone, because there was nowhere left to look. What Reardon had done wasn't just a betrayal of alliance, it was a dismantling of immunity. And in a room like this, when one of your own stands up and says, "He asked me to lie," it doesn't just shift the narrative, it ends it. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't have to, because her silence now wasn't strategy. It was proof. Proof that what she carried wasn't just evidence, but endurance. That every moment she had been underestimated, sidelined, interrupted, challenged, or ignored had brought her to this exact second. And in this second, the entire system blinked first. She didn't need to look at the committee, or the cameras, or the press. She looked only at Byron, a quiet, steady gaze, not with vengeance, with timing. Because truth doesn't shout when it wins. It just stands still long enough to be undeniable. And just when the room thought it had exhaled, Crockett raised one more hand and buried what little defense he had left. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand. She didn't need theatric gestures or procedural preamble. Jasmine Crockett simply tapped once on her tablet, and the screen behind her changed. A new document faded into view, crisp, official, and devastating in its familiarity. IRS Form 4562, Depreciation and Amortization. The corner of the chamber's lighting glinted off its header like the edge of a knife. The numbers came next, projected large enough that even the most resistant eyes could not pretend to miss them. Jasmine let the silence thicken before she spoke, not out of hesitation, but out of discipline. "This," she said, her voice smooth as glass, "is a depreciation schedule filed with the IRS for the fiscal year in question. The reported value of the primary asset in question was listed as $13.4 million. She paused. Not for effect, for precision. "Now," she continued, swiping left, "this is the loan application submitted to Capstone Commercial Lending Group just 3 weeks earlier." A second document appeared beside the first, nearly identical in layout, save for one brutal difference. The same asset, valued at $38.9 million. She let the numbers hang there, side by side. One filed under oath to the federal government, one submitted to a lender for the purpose of securing preferential interest rates, and below each document, one common thread: Byron Donald's signature. Neat, identical, irrefutable. "Same property," she said. "Same fiscal quarter, same signer." The room didn't move, but something inside it collapsed. She didn't raise accusations. She didn't hurl insults. She only asked one brutal final question. "Which one of these statements is false, Congressman?" For a split second, he looked like he might answer. Byron straightened, a breath catching in his throat as he leaned toward the microphone. His mouth opened, the beginnings of a counter-narrative already forming on his lips. Something about clerical error, maybe, or staff oversight, or legal interpretation. But he never got the chance, because at that exact moment, the rear door to the hearing chamber opened with a deliberate click. And this time, there was no mistaking the sound. 2 federal agents in dark blue suits entered side by side, each carrying a leather portfolio, each walking with the purposeful calm of men who never arrive by accident. Their badges flashed briefly as they approached the dais, ignoring cameras, ignoring gasps, and heading straight for the witness table. The room froze. Byron stopped mid-breath, his shoulders already strained, locked into a posture somewhere between defiance and dread. One agent reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope, sealed and stamped. He leaned forward, placed it directly on the desk in front of Byron without saying a word, and stepped back. The subpoena was real, official, and inescapable. For the first time in the entire hearing, Byron Donalds had no words. He stared at the envelope like it might catch fire, like it didn't belong to him, like the letters spelling his name weren't printed in cold black ink. But they were. And beside it, still projected on the screen for the nation to see, were the 2 documents, his lies laid bare in digital fluorescence. Someone in the back of the room stood quietly and left, the weight of history pressing against their ribs. One reporter whispered into a mic, his voice barely audible, "We are witnessing what could be the final moment of Congressman Byron Donald's political life." The committee chair said nothing. The cameras didn't blink. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't move. Because she didn't need to. She had just pulled truth from ink and silence, and the system had finally responded. Not with applause, but with accountability. The subpoena had done its job. The weight of the truth was now a physical thing, sitting on Byron Donalds' desk like a loaded weapon. And all that remained was silence. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Not at first. She let the silence stretch, not out of showmanship, but because she understood that sometimes silence is where the deepest truths are finally heard. She stood still as the chamber breathed in its collective disbelief, each person silently recalibrating their understanding of what they'd just witnessed. Cameras didn't flash, no gavel slammed, and yet something final had just occurred. Across from her, Byron Donalds sat motionless. The man who had strutted into the hearing with a tailored suit and a smirk now looked like a monument to his own undoing. His shoulders, once squared with arrogance, now folded slightly inward, his head down, not in reflection, but in avoidance. He blinked once, then again, slow and unsteady. His hand hovered over the subpoena, as if unsure whether to touch it or push it away. Like a name carved into a gravestone he didn't want to admit was his own. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. With every breath she had taken since the hearing began, she had built toward this moment, not with rage, not with vengeance, but with relentless precision. She had come armed not with bravado, but with facts, not with fury, but with patience. And now, as the room sat in stunned quiet, she began to gather her things, one folder at a time. Each document she'd used to corner him was returned to her case with the same calm she had carried through every blow. There were no hurried movements, no triumphant gestures, only discipline, control, respect for the evidence. Her hands moved smoothly, paper sliding against paper, the muted click of a tablet case closing, the soft hiss of a zippered binder sealing everything back into place. But it wasn't just stationery being packed away. It was a career's worth of credibility. It was the weight of every time she'd been talked over in hearings. Every time a man had leaned back in his chair and chuckled dismissively when she demanded real answers. Every time her brilliance had been mistaken for bravado and her poise mislabeled as attitude. She folded it all shut, placed it under her arm and stood. And then, only then, did she look at him. Her gaze wasn't cruel. It wasn't even cold. It was honest. The kind of gaze that holds no judgment, only recognition. She wasn't looking at a rival. She was looking at the truth, laid bare, unprotected, no longer hidden behind the smoke and mirrors of power. Then finally she spoke, just one line. "I don't need you to confess." Her voice was quiet, centered, but it carried like a verdict. The documents already did. It wasn't a closing statement. It was a tombstone. The line didn't need amplification, and it didn't provoke rebuttal. It was too simple, too irrefutable, too complete. Even the microphones didn't crackle. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Byron flinched, barely, but it was there. He had reached for the microphone out of habit, a lifetime of performance ready to launch one last pivot, one final misdirection. But his hand froze midair, then drifted back down to the table, landing near the unopened subpoena, as if it too understood there were no words left that wouldn't crumble in the air. His posture collapsed slowly. His spine curled. His arms folded against his stomach, like a man bracing for a punch he'd already taken. Then he did something no one expected. He sat back completely. His back hit the chair in full, as if the invisible scaffolding of ego had finally given way. His chest rose with a deep, hollow breath, and his eyes, red-rimmed now, didn't blink. They just stared, vacant, wide, and unfocused. The silence in the room didn't break. It spread. To the aides who had once hovered behind him, avoiding his eyes now like he was a contagious failure. To the fellow committee members who had once nodded along with his every deflection, now suddenly fascinated with their pens or the floor or a corner of the ceiling. Even his former allies on the panel refused to meet his gaze. Their stillness wasn't stoic. It was strategic withdrawal, because when the ship goes down, even the rats know when to leave. No one offered him comfort, not a hand on the shoulder, not a whispered reassurance, not even eye contact. No one stood for Byron Donalds, And yet Jasmine stood, still, undefended, unsponsored, but unshaken. The woman who had walked into this chamber carrying the weight of expectation, of disbelief, of 1,000 silent dismissals and whispered doubts, now stood in absolute clarity. She didn't need anyone to stand with her, because truth had already done it. She didn't look to the gallery. She didn't scan the faces in the crowd. She didn't search for recognition, because the point of this moment was never her victory. It was accountability, and accountability doesn't need applause. It just needs to happen, and it had. She turned slowly, deliberately, and walked away from the dais. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, each step echoing like punctuation at the end of a closing argument the whole nation had just heard. She didn't look back, not once, because there was nothing left behind her that could touch her anymore. In her silence, there was thunder. In her stillness, there was judgment. And in her departure, there was history. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped off Capitol Hill, the building behind her wasn't the only institution that had cracked open. It started as a tremor, a quiet swell on political Twitter. A 30-second clip aired on C-SPAN's midday broadcast. But by the time the clip reached its 20th repost on X, and the first major cable outlet re-aired Byron Donald's face, the frozen, pale silence as the subpoena landed, it became something else entirely. The media didn't just cover it, it ignited. Every major network cut into programming by nightfall. CNN used words like tectonic. MSNBC called it the cleanest public evisceration of financial deception since Enron. Fox tried to reframe it, partisan theatrics masquerading as oversight. But even their legal analyst paused mid-segment and admitted on air, "I've never seen a takedown that airtight. If she's grandstanding, she brought receipts." The next morning, the Crockett reckoning appeared in 72 newspapers before 8 a.m. It wasn't just a headline, it became the national headline. The New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Tribune, and even the Wall Street Journal ran lead editorials. Photos of Byron slumped at the committee table, subpoena in front of him, Jasmine standing behind her chair, became front-page architecture. That image alone would go on to win a Pulitzer. But the media wasn't the only entity in freefall. By 10:30 a.m., Capital Liberty Bank had already suspended its lending operations with the Donalds Group, citing extraordinary exposure risk. By noon, Grand Coast Trust followed suit, then Hawthorne Financial, then a fourth. In 36 hours, the once vaulted organization, Byron's Pride, the machine behind the curtain, lost $118 million in liquidity access. Internal audits were ordered. External investigators deployed. Phone calls stopped getting returned. Contracts were paused indefinitely. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched a preliminary inquiry within 2 business days. The Treasury Department issued a statement by day 3. A sealed subpoena landed at the office of Byron's real estate compliance officer before the week ended. Whispers of asset seizures began circulating. Insiders started flipping. Whistleblowers who had once vanished into the legal fog were resurfacing with documents, phone recordings, and first-person statements. What began as a single hearing turned into a full-scale financial contagion. Across boardrooms, CEOs whispered the same phrase, "Get us away from anything with his name on it." But the greatest shift didn't happen in courtrooms or bank vaults. It happened in the culture. In classrooms, Jasmine's speech became a topic of debate. On college campuses, student protesters held up her image on hand-painted signs. "Let her speak. Truth is not angry. Reckoning activated." At the National Museum of American History, her closing line was engraved on a temporary wall display about women in government accountability. Clips of her precision takedown flooded TikTok. Gen Z called her the truth sniper. Boomers called her the iron in the courtroom. Even conservative veterans admitted in calls to talk radio, "I might not like how she says it, but I can't deny what she did." And Jasmine? She stayed quiet. For 3 days. No tweets, no interviews, no selfies with fans outside the Hill. When asked by a Capitol reporter what came next, she simply said, "I don't chase the camera. The work's not done." But the work, for once, was demanding her voice. Across every media channel, people weren't just curious. They were waiting. And then the networks announced it. Primetime address, 8 p.m., live. 43 million households tuned in. There was no backdrop, no flag, no orchestra swell, no handlers hovering off camera. Just Jasmine Crockett standing center stage on a darkened set, surrounded by silence, a single white ring of light overhead. She didn't wear a bright power color. No designer heels, no costume of dominance, just black, clean, elegant, undeniably real. She stepped forward into the light, took a deep breath, and looked into the camera like it had wronged her personally. They'll tell you this was about ambition, that I was after headlines, that I wanted a moment. Her voice was calm, but it didn't drift. It carried. But I didn't ask for a moment. I asked for accountability, and when that didn't come, I built one. The sentence hit like a hammer, but it didn't rise in pitch. She didn't need to shout. She had finally found the national volume she'd been denied for years. I was told I was too loud, too passionate, too unprofessional. I was told to smile more, to sit back, to let the process work. She looked down for just a breath, and when she looked back up, her face was stone. But process doesn't protect people like me. It protects people like him. She paused, not because she lost her place, but because the silence now belonged to her. I didn't raise my voice today. I raised the truth. And then, what would become a cultural earthquake, delivered in perfect stillness. Don't call me angry. I'm just a woman carrying the truth. That line cracked through the country like thunder. In millions of living rooms, people sat back in stunned silence. In bars, it played on silent televisions, with every head turned toward the screen. In airports, people missed boarding calls. In churches, the next Sunday's sermons included it. In textbooks, it would be printed before the year ended. It wasn't just a line. It was a sentence that freed a generation of women from apologizing for being direct. The speech lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. No applause, no outro, just silence. Then a fade to black. And across the country, people stood. Not because they were told to, but because they had seen something they couldn't unsee. The cameras had gone dark. The headlines moved on. But for those who watched it unfold, those who felt something shift in the stillness after her final line, the real story was only beginning. Because the moment wasn't about the scandal, it was about the silence after it broke. The kind of silence that stays with you, that presses into your chest long after the courtroom empties. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like something sacred just happened, and no one dares speak over it. Jasmine Crockett didn't leave the building victorious. She left it changed. And that change wasn't just for her. It was for anyone who has ever been told to lower their voice in the face of power. That was the real reckoning, because power has rules, unwritten, unspoken, but enforced with ruthless consistency. Power decides who speaks first and who waits to be called on. It decides whose anger is righteous and whose is unprofessional. It decides which mistakes are excused and which become character assassination. It makes people like Byron Donalds look polished even when lying, and makes people like Jasmine look emotional even when telling the truth. And for decades, that system worked because people didn't fight it with precision. They either screamed and were dismissed or stayed silent and were erased. But Jasmine Crockett chose a third path. She walked in carrying facts like weapons, and she didn't raise her voice once. Because she knew the truth didn't need volume, it needed room. And when the system didn't give her any, she carved it open with evidence. That's what people saw. That's what couldn't be spun or silenced. That a black woman, unapologetically direct, surgically prepared, visibly outnumbered, walked into the most powerful hearing room in the country and didn't demand respect. She commanded it, not with charm, not with access, with receipts, with spreadsheets and signatures and surveillance footage. With a hard drive handed to her by a woman who had been threatened into silence, who looked at Jasmine and said, she was the only one who believed me. And that's where the human lesson lives, because beneath the subpoenas and camera angles and media coverage is the unspoken truth Jasmine made visible. That in America, some people have to be perfect just to be believed. That for some of us, truth isn't enough. We have to deliver it flawlessly, without stumbling, without emotion, without margin for error. We have to be judges, juries, historians, and data analysts just to get 5 seconds of credibility in a room full of men who have lied their way into power for decades. And yet Jasmine stood there, stone calm, hand steady, while a nation watched the machinery of corruption collapse in real time. It wasn't just bravery, it was survival, weaponized. She had no army, no billionaire backing, no network execs feeding her scripts, just her voice, her preparation, her refusal to be gaslit by a system that only ever took women like her seriously after the damage had already been done. And still, she didn't gloat. She didn't drop the mic. She stood, zipped her binder, and said one sentence that shattered an empire. "I don't need you to confess. The documents already did." That wasn't just a line. That was every woman who had ever been talked over in a meeting. Every lawyer who'd been told her tone was too aggressive. Every whistleblower who was buried under red tape. Every public defender who walked into a courtroom knowing the odds were fixed. That was every person who'd ever had to memorize the rules just to be allowed in the room, and then had those rules rewritten when they got there. That was survival, turned into policy. Truth, turned into justice. And here's the part they don't write on plaques. Truth hurts, especially when it lands in the hands of the underestimated. Because Jasmine didn't just defeat Byron, she exposed how many systems had to protect him for that long, how many people had looked the other way, how many colleagues changed their votes, how many banks smoothed over documents, how many aides redacted things just in case, and still, none of it stopped her. Because here's the truth most people don't want to admit. Silence is never neutral. It either protects the lie or becomes the reason it survives. And Jasmine? She turned that silence inside out. She made it reveal everything it had been hiding. And that's the human cost, the lesson carved in fire. That when you stand for truth, you will stand alone. At first, you will be called angry, unprofessional, divisive, difficult, disrespectful, dangerous. But those are just the words used by people afraid of what you might expose. And Jasmine knew that. She wore every one of those insults like armor. And when the moment came, she didn't swing first. She waited. She let the truth rise like smoke. Let the lies collapse under their own weight. And when it was finally quiet, when no one could interrupt, when the documents had done their work, she gave them the line that will echo for a generation. "Don't call me angry. I'm just a woman carrying the truth." That wasn't defiance. That was liberation. And for every woman who had to carry her truth alone, for every student, every mother, every junior staffer, every survivor, every professional who was told her voice was too much, her presence too sharp, her expectations too high, Jasmine Crockett walked into the fire and came out with a blueprint. Not for vengeance, for justice that doesn't need applause, for truth that doesn't ask permission, for power that can't be inherited, only earned. That is the Crockett reckoning. And if you listen closely, not to the headlines, not to the anchors, but to the silence she left behind, you heard something else too, the sound of a system cracking. Not because someone yelled, but because someone finally told the truth loud enough to be undeniable. And as the applause faded and the headlines cooled, what remained wasn't a scandal. It was a lesson carved into the bones of the country by a woman who refused to look away. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't come to play a role. She came to confront the script, the one written long before she ever stepped into the chamber. The one that says women like her don't win. That truth can only be heard when it wears a certain face, speaks with a certain accent, or comes from a certain background. The one that offers you a seat at the table, then dares you to speak, knowing full well they plan to mute you the moment you do. Jasmine didn't challenge that system with rage. She challenged it with clarity. And clarity in a world of noise is the most dangerous thing of all. She wasn't just cross-examining a corrupt man. She was standing in the center of a machine built to excuse him. And the truth is, that machine never saw her coming. Not because she was hidden, but because they never expected someone like her to matter. She had the wrong look, the wrong tone, the wrong background. Too black, too blunt, too prepared, too exact. And so when she began to speak, they assumed it was temporary noise. They didn't realize they were listening to the end of their immunity. But she realized something that morning that would carry through everything she did. Power isn't afraid of outrage. It's afraid of evidence. The evidence of her survival, of her voice not cracking, of her hands not shaking, of her questions slicing through rehearsed lies like wire through glass. Power didn't expect to lose, not because it didn't see risk, but because it had always been protected by the lie that truth only counts when it comes from the right mouth. And that's the human lesson, that when a system is built to protect itself, it will try to destroy you for simply telling the truth too well. It will call you bitter when you're clear, unprofessional when you're precise, dangerous when you stop asking for permission to speak. Jasmine didn't raise her voice once. She didn't pound her fist. She didn't weaponize her pain. She didn't ask for sympathy. She let the evidence do the talking. She sat in that chair and pulled the entire machine apart using nothing but facts, posture, and presence. She didn't just survive the fire. She became the one who lit it. But survival isn't free. And that's the part no one talks about. The part where being brilliant still gets labeled as threatening. Where being right still gets you treated like a risk. Where the moment you speak with certainty, someone behind you whispers, "She thinks she knows everything." Where every victory comes with backlash, isolation, and quiet resentment from the very system that forced you to fight in the first place. Jasmine Crockett didn't just fight for justice. She fought through exhaustion, through slander, through quiet backroom deals meant to shut her out before she ever began. She fought through questions that were really accusations, through eye rolls and sidelong glances, through debates where her credibility was measured against how gently she smiled while speaking. And even then, she stood her ground and forced the world to look at the truth she refused to carry alone. Because the most radical thing you can do in a world built on performative civility is to tell the truth without apologizing for how it makes people feel. And that's exactly what Jasmine did. She didn't demand respect. She embodied it, not just for herself, but for every person who has ever been told to wait their turn. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.